You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Michael Dobbs. Michael Dobbs has been on the podcast once before to talk about his book, detailing Richard Nixon's 6 months between his reelection and the resignation of his top aides in 1973. But today he's on to talk about his book, 1 Minute to Midnight. It's the definitive account of the most terribly supreme moment of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we are recording this on October 22nd, which is the 59th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's nationally televised address, in which he revealed to Americans and the world what the top level of our government suspected for weeks, that the Soviet Union was placing offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. It was in this speech that he announced a naval quarantine was being effected around the Caribbean island. If you are old enough to remember this event, then you are old enough to remember how scared you were. 1 Minute to Midnight, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro on the brink of nuclear war was a New York Times bestseller. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, in her review, in her comment, said, "I didn't think there was another thing one could write about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this is so well done." Fareed Zakaria of CNN called it a gripping, moment-by-moment account of the crisis, the best one I've read. Mr. Dobbs, thank you very much for coming back on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
You were a young man of 12, if I may say, when the Cuban Missile Crisis played out. What do you remember from that time?
Actually, I was a schoolboy in England at a boarding school, and I remember the day of Kennedy's speech, or the day after, the teacher came into the classroom and said that there's this very grave situation, and it looks as though the Soviet Union and the United States are on the brink of nuclear war. And But we didn't have that same teacher again until a week later. And by the time he came back and briefed us all, it was all over. So I spent the week wondering what would happen. And in the end, it was all peacefully diffused.
You've had a long, distinguished career as a journalist and a historian, documenting Cold War issues. Your book, 6 months, I forget the exact title.
In 1945.
1945, yeah. Right. I read that actually as well, and it's terrific. What led you to write this book?
Well, I had been a reporter for the Washington Post in Moscow right at the end of the Cold War, actually, when communism collapsed and the Soviet Union disintegrated. And I'd written a book called Down with Big Brother, which was about the collapse of communism. And having written about the collapse of communism, I thought I'd try to tackle the height of the Cold War, the tensest moments in the Cold War, which, of course, is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And when I thought about writing it, everybody said, well, there have been a lot of books about the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's not all that much new to say, but I was surprised at the amount of new material, particularly from the Russian side. I mean, there'd been quite a bit from the American side, but that was the American story. And really what was interesting to me was to integrate the American story with the Russian and Cuban story, and also not only to look at what was happening at the highest level between Kennedy and Khrushchev, but what was happening on the ground, on the front lines of the Cold War, so to speak, between American and Russian and Cuban soldiers. And it was really at the ground level that the real risk of nuclear war, in my view, originated, because the real risk came from events sort of running out of the control, out of the ability of the top leaders to control them. And there are a number of incidents that took place on the front lines that the leaders didn't know anything about that could have escalated into a full-blown nuclear war.
Would you care to give us one or two? It comes through in your book about how pilots strayed off course, and they had certain lower level commanders who thought they had authority to fire or authority to engage, and that's where your book, I think, really shines.
Right. I think there are a number of incidents, and it's difficult to single out just one. But, I think we were in the early stages of a nuclear war in 1962. And, just to mention a couple, the Soviets had sent submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes to escort their ships to Cuba. And the Americans knew about these submarines because they had the ability to track Soviet submarines at that period. And they were trying to bring these submarines to the surface by hurling down depth charges or hand grenades. And what they didn't know, the Americans, was that the Soviet submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes that could have completely blown an entire American fleet out of the water. And the atmosphere in these submarines, they're tiny little tin cans, similar to the German U-boats in World War II, was, frenetic. The Soviet sailors didn't know what was happening, and they were tempted at times to use their nuclear torpedoes to prevent what they saw as a humiliation by the Americans. And there are other incidents in which, on the most dangerous day of the crisis, actually an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and another went missing over the Soviet Union. And the Soviets sent up MiG fighters to try to bring it down. In the event, the American U-2 escaped back to the United States, but you could also envisage circumstances in which that incident could have triggered a nuclear war. And there are other incidents as well. It was simply caused by the fact that in 1962, neither the Soviet Union nor the US completely controlled the launch of nuclear weapons. The decision to launch could have been made in some circumstances by relatively low-level officers, lieutenants, captains, majors. And there was a lot that Khrushchev and Kennedy didn't understand about what was happening at the ground level.
In reading the reviews of your book, one thing that comes through from the reviewers is that you debunked a legend or two, because a lot of legends, they crop up around important historical events. What were, let's say, one or two myths that you examined and found to either be not true or perhaps exaggerated?
Well, there was one in particular that was incorporated into the movie 13 Days, which depicts this confrontation on the blockade line, the quarantine line between American ships and Soviet missile-carrying ships. And supposedly the Soviet missile-carrying ships came right up to the blockade line. The commander of the American destroyer flotilla is in direct communication with the White House. The president thinks that the Soviets are about to violate that blockade line that he's established. He's ordering the American destroyers to fire on the Soviet ships. And at the last moment, the Soviet ships turn around. This is the so-called eyeball to eyeball moment when supposedly Khrushchev and Kennedy were, eyeball to eyeball, and Khrushchev blinked. I mean, I discovered from looking at the American records and also interviewing Soviets that moment never happened. I mean, there were many dangerous things that were happening, but Khrushchev had ordered his missile-carrying ships to turn around the day before, and the missile-carrying ships never reached the blockade line. There was this clash between the Soviet submarines and US destroyers, or dangerous incidents, but insofar as the clash on the blockade line, the confrontation depicted in that movie, and a lot of Cuban Missile Crisis literature, actually, that absolutely never happened.
What did you learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis that you didn't know beforehand? You're obviously a learned scholar and deep into the archives and the history itself, but what was your I didn't know that moment?
Well, there was a lot. I mean, I just mentioned a couple of things. I mean, mainly how the Soviets were handling their nuclear weapons on Cuba, which I pieced together from interviews with Soviet veterans, but also American intelligence reports. And frequently the Americans, I mean, they were gathering a lot of intelligence, but they didn't know how to interpret it. And for example, the simple question of where the Soviet nuclear weapons were stored on Cuba, that was a mystery to the CIA. But I was able to piece that together and show precisely the bunkers where the Soviet weapons were stored and how they were moved about. Also, to reveal a plan to attack the US naval base at Guantanamo, which was actually put into its early stages, and how the Russians had a very crude sort of cruise missile that could be launched against the naval base, which they brought up right to the periphery of the naval base on the most dangerous day of the crisis. And so there's a whole lot of detail about the handling of nuclear weapons on both sides, but particularly on the Soviet side, and things that the CIA simply didn't know. I mean, the president, they knew where the missiles were, but they didn't know where the warheads were. And that was absolutely crucial information, because it's only after the warheads are mated to the missiles that they can be launched against an American target.
What made you choose the title of your book, 1 Minute to Midnight? It's a metaphor for something, I'm sure.
Right. Well, 1 Minute to Midnight, there's a group called the Federation of American Scientists, which devised what they call a nuclear clock, which is meant to show how close the mankind is to nuclear annihilation. And they've been moving this clock around over the years. I think they devised this clock in the 50s sometime. And anyway, metaphorically, the clock stood at 1 minute to midnight in October 1962. And so that was the reason for the title of this book.
You mentioned it just a few minutes ago, but there have been so many terrific books written about Cold War topics since the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of my favorites is David Edmonds, who wrote a terrific book on the Fisher-Spassky match in 1972 that makes extensive use of those archives. He actually came on the podcast. His book is called Bobby Fischer Goes to War: How the Soviets Lost the Most Extraordinary Chess Match of All Time. How did these archives help you? And would it have been conceivable to have written your book without them?
I don't think so. No, I mean, generally it takes 40 to 50 years for the archives to reveal their secrets. And that's true on the American side. And of course, the Soviet side, everything was completely secret up until the collapse of communism. And it was only after the collapse of communism that it became possible to talk to Soviet veterans who'd had experience in Cuba, and also to gain access to Soviet archives. I mean, the Cuban archives, I went to Cuba, but actually the Cuban archives are still pretty much closed. And so there's a lot we don't know on the Cuban side. I mean, for example, that the plan to attack the naval base at Guantanamo was the man in charge of that whole area of Cuba back in October 1962 was Fidel Castro's brother, Raul Castro, the late president of Cuba. So he would have been informed and involved in any attack on the Guantanamo naval base. And there must be Cuban archives that describe that, but we haven't had access to them. Access is banned.
And it would have been interesting to know how the Cubans felt at the time about these two superpowers basically negotiating about their country, and just like, you're going to have to accept whatever we come up with. Did you get a sense that there was some resentment on behalf of the Cuban government, that they're just kind of a bit player in their own country?
There was huge resentment. Actually, that we know quite a lot about, because Fidel Castro has talked about it extensively and has himself participated in conferences describing, what he felt about being the plaything of, as he saw it, of the two superpowers. When Khrushchev announced that he was taking out his missiles from Cuba, Castro felt betrayed, and he flew into a rage. He broke a mirror or some kind of portrait and berated the Soviet ambassador, and it led to a crisis in Cuban-Soviet relations. Of course, Cuba didn't have anywhere else to turn except for the Soviets, and ironically, I think the Cuban Missile Crisis actually consolidated Castro's grip on power, because it put an end to American attempts to overthrow him. But initially, at least, he felt betrayed by the Soviets.
And there was some question, was there not, on behalf of the Soviet leaders, as to whether Castro would even accept the missiles in the beginning. And through some negotiation, they reached an agreement. Is that fair to say that that the initial discussions between the Soviet Union and Cuba could have gone differently?
They could have gone. I mean, Castro was sort of had a thing about Cuban sovereignty, and which he defended against Yankee imperialism, but he also sort of was prickly on that subject with the Soviets as well. But on the other hand, I think he wanted Soviet nuclear missiles in the island because he saw them as the ultimate guarantor of his independence. I mean, the main enemy, as he saw it, was not the Soviet Union, it was the United States. And he saw Soviet nuclear missiles as a way of defending Cuba against the United States. So although he played hard to get, I think he was quite happy to get those nuclear weapons. And he was dismayed, as I said, when Khrushchev decided to withdraw them.
Did Castro want control of them, control of the ability to launch?
Well, ideally, he would have loved to have had control, but the Soviets weren't about to give it to him. I mean, Khrushchev, he was, on the one hand, he thought of Castro as a kind of romantic figure, who stirred up their memories of the revolution in Russia. But on the other hand, they all thought of Castro as rather unreliable and unstable, and they certainly weren't going to give up any kind of control of their nuclear weapons to the Cubans.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Michael Dobbs, who has written the definitive account of probably the most supreme moment of the Cold War, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. His book is called 1 Minute to Midnight. We are discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis with him today. It started, according to most accounts, on October 16th, 1962, and you could say it lasted until November because of the quarantine, but a lot of people put the denouement at October 28th. Do you believe that the Cuban Missile Crisis is the supremely terrifying moment of the Cold War, where we got as close as we were ever going to get to annihilating each other?
Yeah, I mean, there have been other tense moments, particularly, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Berlin airlift. There was a nuclear scare in 1980, but I think the Cuban Missile Crisis is the iconic moment. It was the last moment when the American military leaders seriously thought that they could win a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. I mean, Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force, actually he was the deputy chief of staff at that moment. He believed that Americans had nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union, and this was an opportunity to put the Russian bear in its place. As he said, we should cut him down to his testicles, and on second thoughts, we should take his testicles off as well. Kennedy had a completely different idea, because although it was true that America could have won a nuclear war against the Soviet Union, we had many more nuclear missiles that could reach Soviet soil than they had that could reach American soil. Kennedy asked, what would happen if just one Soviet nuclear missile made it through? And he was told, well, perhaps 500,000 dead. And that was unacceptable to him, both as a politician and as a human being. So he said, we can't fight nuclear wars. Nuclear weapons are only good for deterring. We can never fight a nuclear war. So, and that question was really settled, I think, at the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was the last time when, some people in the US military establishment, particularly Curtis LeMay, thought it was possible to actually win a nuclear war.
Khrushchev sure liked his testicles metaphors. As I recall, he didn't Khrushchev call Berlin the testicles of the West, and all I have to do is squeeze them and I can make them howl?
Yeah, that's correct. He came from peasant family in Ukraine, and he spoke in a very colorful language. And, that was the sort of other incidents I could give of Khrushchev's colorful use of metaphors. But he was a very, crude, he was complete opposite to Kennedy in some ways. I mean, he was old enough to be Kennedy's father, and he had a very crude understanding of US-American relations. He believed in the sort of power, and he thought he could bully Kennedy. And Kennedy, felt he had to show Khrushchev that he couldn't be bullied.
Because they had met in Vienna in the previous year, and you had the Berlin Wall going up at the same time. And there were instances where, to your point, Khrushchev bullied or tried to bully Kennedy. And as I recall, Kennedy made a comment to that effect after Vienna. Yeah. He felt like he had been strong-armed or bullied a bit. How do you think that the previous encounters or interactions between the two fueled how they approached this from kind of I want to say, not necessarily a machismo perspective, but if you're going to be the leaders of the superpowers, you got to have stones and you got to have an ego.
Right. You've got to have cojones, as Madeleine Albright put it in another context. They only met once personally, which was at Vienna, and Kennedy came away from that meeting sort of feeling that Khrushchev had treated him like a young kid, and he had to show Khrushchev that he was not going to be pushed around like that, or the United States was not going to be pushed around. So that was certainly part of the background to the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Khrushchev actually deployed nuclear weapons in Cuba 100 miles from American shores, those few missiles in Cuba didn't actually affect the overall balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. It didn't really matter whether you fire a missile from Cuba that hits the United States, or you fire it from the Soviet Union and hits the United States, we still had overwhelming numbers of missiles that could, survive any first strike and launch a devastating retaliation against the Soviet Union. So it didn't actually change that much in military terms, but it was a psychological, political threat to Kennedy. And he felt that if he allowed Khrushchev to get away with this, that would affect this sort of psychological balance of power between the two superpowers, the prestige of the two superpowers. So that was one reason why he decided early on that he had to get those missiles out of Cuba.
Didn't after Vienna, their summit, as I recall, did Khrushchev say, "I think we scared that young man," or something similarly condescending?
Yeah, I mean, he said that Kennedy was young enough to be his son and was pretty contemptuous about him. And he certainly thought that he had won that encounter.
And the people who were briefing Kennedy about the possibility of a first strike using nuclear weapons, which is different than a first use. First strike is meant to basically disable the other side's ability to strike back. And please correct me, Michael, if I have that wrong. But do you think there was a wry smile inside Kennedy when he was being told once again of the overwhelming nuclear superiority of the United States relative to the Soviet Union? Because in 1960, in his campaign for president, he pounded home the notion of a missile gap that existed between the two countries. And his point was that the Soviet Union was on the higher side of the gap. How wrong was he in 1960, and how overwhelming a superiority did we have in October of 62?
Well, Kennedy, as you say, campaigned on this supposed missile gap in the Soviet favor. And because this information was classified, he didn't know at the time that the gap was actually favored the United States. And we had about 10 times the number of missiles or nuclear weapons, including airborne nuclear weapons that could land on Soviet soil than the Soviets had. So the advantage was very much on the US side. Kennedy, he had actually read a book about the origins of the First World War called The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. And he saw how the great powers drifted to war or got entangled in war in 1914. And he was determined this wouldn't happen again, particularly in a nuclear age, which would, mean the end of civilization as we know it. So he had that, in his mind, and he kept on. He had also served as a young lieutenant junior grade out in the Pacific during the Second World War. Actually, Khrushchev had also seen a lot of the war from a more senior level on the Soviet side. But both those leaders had an idea of what war meant and the devastation that could be caused by war. And they both understood that a nuclear war would be infinitely worse than a conventional war. So that, I think, acted as a restraint on both of them.
And this notion of sort of preventive war, or we're going to have to fight them eventually. Let's do it now while we have the advantage. It happened in the late 19th century where Imperial German generals wanted to fight then Russia because the thought was we're so much stronger. They're only going to get stronger. Clash is inevitable, so let's do it now. Was that some of the thinking among the Joint Chiefs and more of the hawkish members of Kennedy's cabinet and Khrushchev's advisors as well?
I think it's definitely Curtis LeMay's thinking. And there's this confrontation that I describe in my book between LeMay and Kennedy, in which LeMay is telling Kennedy that basically you're trying to appease the Soviets. And he actually uses that phrase, appeasement, which is a loaded phrase in Kennedy's case, because Kennedy's father, Joseph, was accused of appeasement in the run-up to the Second World War. He had been the US ambassador to London. And so, Kennedy was very upset by that. And so Kennedy actually had people on both sides who were doubting his cojones. On the Russian side, Khrushchev, and on the American side, Curtis LeMay, and people who thought like him. But he wasn't going to lead America into a nuclear war if he could possibly help it.
Is it fair to say that the first big decision, the one that set the course for internal American debate and action, was when President Kennedy declared to his team that the missiles cannot be tolerated, much like 30 years later almost, where George H.W. Bush said this will not stand? How did Kennedy's resolution that we can't allow this to happen, how did that set what happened next?
Well, I'd say there were two important early decisions. One was that, we will not, this has to be reversed. But the second important decision, which they thought about, was, whether they would take those missiles out. I mean, they knew where the missile sites were, and they could have bombed the missile sites. And they thought they had a few days grace because they thought the missiles weren't quite ready to fire. And there were some people in the Kennedy entourage who felt that they should take those missile sites out immediately, but instead they decided to introduce what was called a quarantine, which was a kind of softer term for a naval blockade, to prevent more Soviet ships from reaching Cuba. And ultimately that gave one time to diffuse the crisis by peaceful means. So that was also a very important moment, the decision not to take the missiles out through bombing raids, but to allow time for diplomatic negotiations.
Forgive this next question, but I couldn't resist asking, if you could have interviewed either President Kennedy or Premier Khrushchev, whom would you rather have talked to about this?
Well, I mean, both of them are interesting. I think as a historian, because less is known of the Soviets, I'd be more interested in talking to Khrushchev than Kennedy, because we know a lot about Kennedy's thinking. We even have tapes of some of those meetings of the ExCom, the group of advisors who were with him during the crisis. But there's still a lot we don't know about Khrushchev. And so personally, I'd be more interested in meeting Khrushchev than Kennedy.
I read a couple of books about the Eisenhower presidency this past summer. And one of the things that comes through is how incredibly interested President Eisenhower was in intelligence, the gathering and the fruits of it. And Kennedy obviously was as well, even though, the Bay of Pigs happened under his watch, but it certainly wasn't planned under his watch. But in reading your book and other articles about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the intelligence process is a huge part of it. The technology seems incredibly primitive to us these days, but at the time it was considered high tech. Talk to us a little bit about the intelligence gathering process and the materials, the equipment they used to do so.
Well, actually, the Cold War was in many ways an intelligence war because it never became a hot war. So it was there's a lot of maneuvering and a lot of information gathering. So the spies were on the front line. And they did, when one thinks of the Cuban Missile Crisis and intelligence, you think, first of all, about the U-2 spy plane, which flew at 60, 70,000 feet, was therefore very difficult to shoot down, although the Soviets did, as we know, develop a capability to shoot down a U-2 spy plane. And it had these long-range cameras that could photograph, very small objects. And that was a game changer because the US was able to gather intelligence, photographic intelligence, both in the Soviet Union and then later in Cuba. And actually, the U-2 technology remained relevant up until very recently. I think U-2 planes were still in operation, certainly in the Iraq War. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps they haven't even gone out of service. Even today, there's still some uses for updated U-2 spy planes.
I think they tried to retire the SR-71, and maybe they brought that back as well. The supersonic, the plane that's so fast, I think it flew from Cincinnati to St. Louis here in the United States in like 12 minutes. I mean, it represented a huge upgrade. I didn't know that the U-2 planes were still being used, but at the time, it was pretty much the best we had because the satellite technology, if the clouds got in the way, it kind of obscured what you were trying to see.
Right. U-2s, certainly up until very recently, I wouldn't be surprised if some U-2s are still in service in some places. Of course, it's largely now been overtaken by satellite technology.
What do you think? You mentioned that you'd love to talk to Khrushchev if you could have. What do you think the impetus was for Khrushchev to roll the dice in such a desperate way? And do you think he misjudged what the American reaction would be?
We had a rather primitive idea of the American reaction and the ability to conceal his missiles in Cuba. I think at one point he says to his generals, well, we won't have any problem concealing them because they look like palm trees, and the Americans will think they're palm trees. Of course, a missile looks very different from a palm tree. But I think there were several motivations on the Soviet side. One, he wanted to even up this nuclear imbalance by he had lots of intermediate range nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles. He didn't have very many long range. So by putting a few intermediate range missiles in Cuba, he could, to some extent, catch up with the Americans. But he also wanted to defend the Cuban Revolution. I mean, there was this kind of romantic idea of, here was a group of people with beards who had deposed this corrupt authoritarian regime, and they had pledged their allegiance to Marxism-Leninism. And Khrushchev thought this was great, right in America's backyard. So they had an idea that once a country had gone socialist or communist, history couldn't be turned back. That was part of what the ideology that they believed in. So I think there was definitely an element which was kind of underappreciated by the Americans of Khrushchev wanting to defend his friend Fidel and making sure that the Americans wouldn't be able to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. I mean, this was preceded by many attempts. Bay of Pigs was only one of them, but there was a whole sabotage campaign against the Castro government. And Khrushchev and Castro were convinced that unless some dramatic action was taken, the Americans would eventually overthrow Castro and the socialist revolution in Cuba.
You couldn't necessarily answer this question, so forgive me for asking it anyway. Do you think Khrushchev would have gone down this route if Eisenhower was president?
Well, that's difficult to say. And in general, I'm sort of wary of kind of hypothetical counterfactual history. We don't know. I mean, it's quite possible he would have done. He probably had more respect for Eisenhower as a military leader than he did for Kennedy initially. But, the basis of, he also felt betrayed by Eisenhower because Eisenhower had sent U-2s over the Soviet Union. So he would have been quite happy to teach Eisenhower a lesson as well. A lot depends on his emotional makeup. He's often reacted emotionally. I mean, he was also upset by the US deployment of intermediate range weapons in Italy and Turkey. He had a country house on the Black Sea, and he would take visitors out and give them to the terrace and give them a pair of binoculars and say, what do you see? And the visitor would say, well, I can't see anything, just see. And Khrushchev would say, well, I can see American missiles aimed at my country house. So, he wanted to get even with the Americans and show that the Soviet Union was a superpower, at least as powerful as the rival American superpower.
You mentioned this a few minutes ago. I just want to revisit for one quick minute, either through your book or through the movies, whether it's 13 Days or Missiles of October, I think is what it's called, with Martin Sheen and William Devane. A movie came out in the 1970s. That's the first movie I remember. That's my first. I was born in 1967. So my first kind of like, what is this movie about? Happened watching that show. But Kennedy's advisors were all over the place. There were hawks, there were doves. What kind of grade would you give the president for handling the differing views of his advisors?
I think that, if you listen to those debates in the XCOM during those 13 days, it's a very high level of debate, and you cannot fail to be impressed by the sort of calm, cool way in which Kennedy manages the whole thing. It's very impressive. There's some people who run down Kennedy's performance. Actually, the former Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, was one of them. He said, well, it was sheer dumb luck that we survived this. And I don't agree with that. I think there was an element of luck involved, but I think it was intelligent luck, both on both sides, that both Kennedy and I think Khrushchev realized that the world had come to the brink and that they had to take steps to step back from the brink before it was too late. So I credit both of them with understanding that and steering us through this crisis that could have turned out a lot worse. I think both of them made mistakes, particularly before the crisis. Khrushchev was erratic. He sent these missiles to Cuba based on sort of wrong assumptions about the American reaction. Kennedy can also be faulted for thinking that he could just launch these sabotage campaigns against Castro without any kind of Soviet reaction. So they both made, mistakes in the run up to the crisis. But I think you have to credit both men with, helping take rational decisions during the crisis that averted the worst.
If you look at some of the documents, and I hate to call them decision trees, but menu of options, you don't think about it. And I didn't think about it too much till flipping through your book again and being reminded that one option the Americans had was simply to just do nothing, that Soviet missiles were a way of life. And, we should just accept it the way they accept ours. I believe Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, is quoted as saying the missiles just didn't change anything. They were not significant. Right. Do you think that's a fair statement? And would it have been possible militarily, if not necessarily politically, for the United States to just say, okay, they've got missiles there, let's move on?
Well, actually, Kennedy, both McNamara and Kennedy were of that view. If you just consider it as a kind of question of the military balance, but it wasn't only a question of the military balance. It was a question of political prestige and the kind of psychological balance between the two leaders. And Kennedy had drawn a red line in the sand before he knew that Khrushchev had deployed nuclear weapons to Cuba. Kennedy had given a speech in which he had said that we will not tolerate this. If it was established that the Soviets had deployed nuclear weapons in Cuba, we would make sure that would be reversed. So he was kind of committed to that red line, in defense of his own red line. And having drawn the red line, it was, practically impossible for him to wriggle out of it, particularly if you recall, in 1962, it was an election year, not a presidential election year, but a congressional election year. This all happened in the run-up to the midterm elections. Kennedy was under great pressure from the Republicans in Congress who were accusing him of, sellout to the Russians. So he would have given his political enemies handed them an election victory on a plate if he had, failed to follow through on his promises about the red line. So politically, it was unacceptable. And that was turned out to be more important than the sort of military balance of power.
And the Democrats did have a good November of 1962 at the ballot box. Indiana elected for the first time a very famous senator named Birch Bayh. He won in 1962. And Nixon, after losing to Kennedy in 1960, famously or infamously lost the California governor's race to Edmund Brown and said, "This is my last press conference." And you don't see the video on the Leaders and Legends podcast, but I can tell you, Mr. Michael Dobbs is smiling as I say, you don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. That turned out not to be true. It's fair to say that the Doves won the argument. But what could the Soviets have done other than launching the missiles? What could they have done to have undermined the Doves' argument and empower people like LeMay to say the Russians only understand strength. This is a provocative move. We've got to punch back hard. What could the Soviets have done to change the internal debate within the Kennedy administration?
Well, the main thing is they could have kept their missiles on Cuba. Then that would have, confronted Kennedy with a very difficult choice. Actually, I think he had a few tricks up his sleeve. Even if on October 28th, Khrushchev had announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles, Kennedy was still determined to go to the extra mile to reach some kind of compromise. And for example, he was willing to trade US missiles in Turkey with Soviet missiles in Cuba. And he was thinking about that trade. In fact, he promised, or rather his brother, Bobby Kennedy, promised the Soviet ambassador in Washington that those missiles would be withdrawn. But the whole thing was kept secret for 40, 50 years. So there was a trade-off, but it wasn't a public trade-off. I think probably Kennedy would have been willing to accept a public trade-off. I mean, so he had a few diplomatic initiatives that he could have used. So I don't think it ever quite reached the point of Kennedy having to call Khrushchev's bluff, because Khrushchev eventually, after all, climbed down.
The popular, or maybe entertainment, movie industry take on the Cuban Missile Crisis focuses on the American side for obvious reasons. Take us inside the Kremlin. We should note that Michael, there's a photo on michaeldobbsbooks.com. I think I have that website correct, where he is literally standing next to the tank while Boris Yeltsin denounces the coup against Gorbachev in the last throes of the Soviet Union. So Mr. Dobbs is both his historical and journalistic credentials are impeccable. But take us inside the Kremlin. What was the mood inside the Soviet Union among top leadership? And are you surprised how it played out once you had a look at those archives?
Well, Khrushchev was, formally in the Soviet Union, the supreme decision-making body was the Politburo, the leadership of the Communist Party, a group of about 12 rather elderly men, no women, who ran the Soviet Union. But in fact, it was a one-man show, Khrushchev, although he had to consult with his Politburo colleagues and inform them about what he was doing. So when Khrushchev, they were kind of listening to all this and listening to his bluster and, supporting him because they had to. But privately, they quite enjoyed seeing him get, his whole policy into a twist, because they never actually, in their heart of hearts, supported him. And if you recall, the following year, in 1964, I think Khrushchev was overthrown by the other Politburo members. And one of the accusations launched against him was that he had initiated all these adventurous, harebrained schemes, one of which was sending missiles to Cuba. So I think he had his rivals in the Soviet leadership. One of them was the man who eventually replaced him, Leonid Brezhnev, who quite enjoyed seeing Khrushchev get himself into this terrible situation and then having to extricate himself, and that certainly led to Khrushchev's demise a couple of years later.
A nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union obviously would not just affect those two countries. How were their respective allies involved in the diplomacy surrounding this event?
Well, obviously, the country that would have been most affected was Cuba itself. And Fidel, the slogan of the Cuban Revolution is Patria o muerte, fatherland or death. And the Cubans were certainly willing to sacrifice themselves if Cuba became a target of nuclear war. Of course, Cuba would have been the first country to have been wiped out in any nuclear exchange. But Castro was a fanatic, and he was willing to, die in the defense of his country and bring his country down with him. He thought that was the best way to defend the revolution, actually, was to show that he was willing to die in the defense of the revolution. Had it come to nuclear war, you can envisage other countries being affected as well, particularly in Europe. Those countries on which US nuclear weapons were stationed, including Turkey, Italy, the UK, they'd have all eventually been dragged into it. And none of them had very much to say about how this crisis would be resolved, because it sort of became a superpower crisis, and there was relatively little consultation with allies on either side.
Kennedy's early year, maybe we say first 18 months as president, from a foreign policy perspective, could be described or characterized as uneven. And I don't think that's a political point. You had the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a huge failure, the building of the Berlin Wall. As you mentioned, we discussed earlier, the Vienna summit with Khrushchev, which in Kennedy's own words didn't go very well. But his performance during the Cuban Missile Crisis gets almost universal acclaim. Do you think his leadership is what really cemented his legacy, along with his martyrdom, but cemented his legacy as a top American leader?
Well, as you say, he made a lot of mistakes, particularly in his first year in office. And I think that he matured as a president, as presidents usually do. Had the Cuban Missile Crisis happened a couple of years earlier, the result might have been different. But he had been tested before, and he had made mistakes, and he had learned from these mistakes. I think that he's not entirely blameless, as I suggested, for the missile crisis. But I think that his main contribution and main strength was that he understood that all kinds of things were happening that he and Khrushchev lacked the ability to control. And it was not a case of, these two leaders who completely controlled their respective military machines facing off against each other. It was two leaders who didn't control their military machines. And thankfully, they understood that, which is why they acted to bring the crisis to an end after just 13 days.
Any book or movie about the Cuban Missile Crisis focuses on John F. Kennedy, of course, from the American side. But how critical was the role played by his brother, Robert Kennedy, as both a trusted advisor and sort of clandestine diplomat and contact for the other side.
Well, JFK used Bobby as his emissary, his back channel to the Soviets through the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin. And Bobby and Dobrynin held several secret meetings during the missile crisis, at which there were these kind of backdoor negotiations. So, Bobby was the Attorney General. Undoubtedly, he had a special relationship with Jack Kennedy. That doesn't mean they were the same person at all. I mean, they were different types of people. Bobby was much more emotional than Jack. But the two brothers trusted each other, and Jack, which is why Jack used Bobby as his envoy to his back channel to Khrushchev. I think that Bobby made a significant contribution as Jack's alter ego during the missile crisis. But it was, ultimately the main decisions were taken by John Kennedy.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're speaking with author Michael Dobbs, discussing his book, 1 Minute to Midnight, which is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was playing out right now, 59 years ago. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis is thought of as an American victory or an American triumph, but that necessarily wasn't the case contemporaneously. There were elected officials and cabinet members and thought leaders who thought that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a defeat, or at least not a clear-cut victory. What was their argument?
Well, people like Curtis LeMay certainly thought it was a defeat, that we had the opportunity to hit the Russian bear on the nose, and we fluffed it. And we also, gave up these missiles in Turkey, which, by the way, were completely obsolete. They were pretty useless. I mean, anything that those missiles in Turkey were able to hit could be hit by American nuclear submarines that were just coming into service at that time. But I think, the overwhelming feeling was one of relief, actually, because this crisis had, built up over 2 weeks. Americans, it's difficult to recall the sort of paranoia of those days, but people had air raid shelters or bomb shelters in their backyards. Kids were taught to duck and cover under their desks if the Soviets launched nuclear weapons. So I think, although there were critics of Kennedy, I think the overwhelming view was one of relief this crisis had been diffused.
Just 2 more questions before we let you go. What were the long-term effects of this crisis for American and Soviet relations?
Well, the Soviets felt that, they felt a sense of humiliation. So I think that led in part to the Soviet nuclear buildup during the 60s and 70s under Brezhnev. But also the group of people around Kennedy, his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, and also McNamara to a certain extent, they thought that, they had understood with the Cuban Missile Crisis the art of crisis management, how to escalate and how to use American military power to make the other side back down without actually going to war. And they, there was a kind of hubris that set in, and they thought they could apply the same techniques to the Vietnamese. And this sort of, in part, explains the escalation of the Vietnam War under President Johnson and that same group of advisors that had served Kennedy. So in some ways, the wrong lessons were drawn from the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, it wasn't that it turned out that controlled escalation was something very difficult to achieve, and it simply didn't work in the Vietnamese case. And the main lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was not that you can manage crises like this, was that you shouldn't get into them in the first place because, they're too risky. And that there are a whole lot of things that a president simply cannot control, even though people may think that a US president is all powerful. He's not all powerful at all. And that should have been the lesson that we took away from the Cuban Missile Crisis, not the idea that a president can calibrate and escalate nuclear or non-nuclear confrontation.
And am I correct in remembering that Khrushchev made the argument that the Soviets got everything they wanted? Like, you're not going to invade Cuba. Those missiles are gone in Turkey. Like, we rolled the dice and we won. But 2 years later, he's out. How wrong was Khrushchev, or was he?
Well, it was undoubtedly a political humiliation for the Soviets and for Khrushchev personally, and that led in part to Khrushchev's own ouster from power a couple of years later. So publicly, it was a defeat for Khrushchev. There's no doubt about that, because the bargain about bringing U.S. missiles out of Turkey was never made public. In fact, it was known to a very small group of people and was not even widely known on the Soviet side. That only became public 40, 50 years later.
You mentioned the movie a few minutes ago. So last question for you is, what did you think of the movie 13 Days, leaving Kevin Costner's attempt at a Boston accent aside for a second? What did you think of the history of that movie? Or did you I asked Susanna Lipscomb, who's a Tudor historian. She came on the podcast about a month ago and asked her, could she watch historic movies and not look at it as a PhD professor, right? Like, just, it's the entertainment and I got to take it. Her answer was yes, except for Tudor movies about the Tudors. She cannot do it. So as a Cold War historian who has written this book, when you watched that movie, and I'm assuming you did, what did you think of it?
Well, I thought it was, it was amusing and certainly entertaining. And I think it sort of captured some of the atmosphere of those times and some of the depictions of, what a Soviet missile looked like were quite accurate. So some of the scenes were quite accurate. On the other hand, as history, it's pretty flawed. A lot of it simply didn't happen, including the confrontation on the blockade line that I talked about, and this relation building up the Kevin Costner character. I think that was one of Kennedy's Irish advisors as his key aide during the crisis. Simply wasn't the case.
Kenny O'Donnell.
Kenny O'Donnell. No, Kenny O'Donnell was an old, political aide of John Kennedy's, but he didn't have the influence he later claimed that movie depicts him as having in the running of the missile crisis. But so, yeah, I mean, you have to take these historical movies with a grain of salt, and they are not always completely historically accurate, to say the least.
So a la Siskel and Ebert, thumbs up or thumbs down?
I'd say one thumb up, one thumb down.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Michael Dobbs, author of 1 Minute to Midnight, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro on the Brink of Nuclear War. Michael, this is the second time you've come on. I'm incredibly grateful. Your books are absolutely amazing, and I can't thank you enough for your time.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we'll chat again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com. veteranstrategies.com.